today to see where the real problem was, looking at the charts that Min and others showed on the effects of soft costs on deploying solar effectively. So we hope to address some of those issues in this panel. We've got a great group of folks that are both doing installations, that are running state agencies, that are manufacturers, and the utilities. So we should be able to foster what should be a dynamic discussion. And rather than do introductions of each individual with bios, we'll let you read the bios in your handouts and jump right into presentations. And I guess we'll start with Elizabeth.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kennedy. I work for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. For those of you who may not know who we are a quasi-public state agency that's focused on accelerating clean energy in the state of Massachusetts. So we do that through a number of methods. One is through sort of sector development, large infrastructure projects. We're working on building out the Port of New Bedford to be sort of the launching pad for offshore wind deployment. We have the Wind Blade Testing Center in Boston. We also work on workforce development and then investment in clean technology startups. The group that I am in specifically is sort of renewable energy generation. So taking commercially available technologies and developing incentive programs to drive people to invest in them. So this is a very broad topic. We talk about standards, permitting, and interconnection. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the state of Massachusetts to address these issues. It's clearly a problem and a cost burden on solar projects. And I get a lot of feedback from the industry that it takes too long, it costs too much. So one thing I wanted to talk about is just the importance of a public agency that it is subsidizing an industry to get data. So while we understand that we need to streamline processes, I think it's very important to emphasize that we need the data, we need project data, we need to know what equipment you're using, we need to know what it's costing so that we can develop programs that effectively assist the market. And there was a comment earlier about production data. I mean, the state of Massachusetts has been collecting solar PV production data since 2002, so we do have a huge wealth of information and data out there, but it's sort of incumbent on project developers to give that to us. We sort of see our role as a facilitator. So we are not a regulatory agency, but what we do is bring stakeholders together to try and tackle some of these issues. So one of the things that we're working on is we've created a DG collaborative to try and address some of the issues that we're dealing with in the state of Massachusetts on interconnection. So looking at an interconnection queue, how can we streamline the process? And so it's bringing all of those stakeholders together. One thing we're finding is that that group of stakeholders is growing. As solar becomes a little more prevalent in the state, people that are wanting to get involved are increasing. So one of our focuses now is we're starting to bring in people like first responders. They want to be involved in sort of stakeholder decision-making processes now. So we're working on the DG Collaborative. We also now have an RFP out for sort of alternative grid improvement. So looking at ways that maybe we can do studies, our role as being able to provide money, we could do studies to help facilitate streamlining. We are looking as a state at potentially working with our Department of Public Utilities and the state to streamline the permitting process on the municipal level, as well as the interconnection application and net metering application. I run a rebate program, so there's all of this paperwork that developers have to deal with or homeowners have to deal with, and it is very burdensome. So while we are not yet to the point where we can have sort of a single application, one thing that we are starting to look at is, well, can we agree on what set of data we want to collect so that you might still have to fill out different applications at different iterations along a project development timeline, but at least you're still providing consistent So that's something that we're looking at currently. I also want to point out that the state of Massachusetts did receive some rooftop solar challenge funding through SunShot, and two things specifically that we're focusing on is permitting on the local municipal level in the state of Massachusetts. All of the permitting for sort of rooftop solar is done individually by each municipality. We have 351 cities and towns in the state of Massachusetts, and they all sort of have their own rules around how to permit solar projects. And that's a problem. And so one thing we're doing is looking to hire a consultant who can help evaluate sort of a subset of those municipalities' permitting processes and figure out what are some best practices and can we sort of disseminate those practices to other cities and towns in the state. And we're also looking to see if we can come up with some best practices in terms of looking at building stock for buildings in Massachusetts and determine which buildings may need structural analyses and which ones don't. Because what we're finding is the building inspector in a town can say, you know what, I want all solar projects to have a stamp structural. So all of a sudden you've now added $1,000 to a residential project just because the building inspector wants it. So if we can come up with a way to provide sort of a surety to them that maybe certain buildings don't need it, but here's some that you should require it, we're hoping to sort of drive down the cost there as well. So that's it. Thank you.
So I actually failed to introduce myself as both moderator and panelist. I'm Andrew Savage with All Earth Renewables, and I also have a short presentation on what you've heard reference to as Vermont's 10-day registration process. So my hope is to be able to share a brief timeline of how that came to be, hopefully as a model for expansion and adoption in other either municipalities or other states. And our registration process was particularly exciting in that it caught the attention of the industry. We had Photon Magazine and Solar Industry Magazine calling. We had the Department of Energy and the SunShot Initiative calling. We had governors from different states calling. And the reason is I think people identified that there was some real promise and some potential with what we created. So I'm going to find the next slide here. But first to give the building blocks for our program. Vermont actually started with what was a very good program for permitting, if you will, now registering solar. So we have a certificate of public good process which identifies exactly that net metered projects are in the public good, and that the legislature and regulators have established that these projects should be seen through, and unless there are certain barriers, whether they be interconnection or siting, that are very significant, that net metered projects should be installed. And so we had a certificate of public good process that was free, administered by our public service board, and essentially supersedes all local zoning. And Vermont is a place where we take zoning and local land use very seriously. So it's not to say that this was something that was just done in the lark, but it was essentially weighing that net meter projects are extremely important and serious as well. So when a CPG is filed previously, you had folks notified, budding landowners, the town planning and zoning boards, the local utility, and a few state agencies. And essentially you were certifying that you were meeting basic requirements of the CPG. It's a 5, 6, 8-page form. I can't remember that well, but it was not that much of a burden. And the time frame for public comment was 30 days. That very often and more often than not stretched to 45 days for one reason or another. The public service board wouldn't get something back. You'd have a small mistake, and it'd be this kind of ping pong that would occur. Unless someone or an adjoining landowner had an issue with your application, then they could file with the board. If there were objections, the public service board would make a ruling. That public service board is a quasi-judicial body, and they'd essentially see the projects through. 99.9% of the time, even if there was someone who raised an issue or a town that raised an issue, the projects would go through. So what we essentially found and what we argued with the legislature was we we have this process that's very good, but could and should be better. It's really not serving as effective a process as it could. And so what we went to the legislature and did was propose a process that would be a simple registration, no notification of the utilities, 25 kW and below for wind and solar. Now, folks know legislative process, you don't always get what you asked for initially, and we didn't. But what we did was we made the case effectively for initially a registration process for 5 kilowatts and below. I did put up here the Sun Run report, which was something that we actually used in the legislature, saying, look, this is part of the problem nationally, that you have unnecessary permitting that actually adds cost to the industry. And as you see here, it's the Sun Run report, $2,500 for each system over 5 years. If we could get rid of those